Hi everyone, welcome. For those who are just joining now, just make sure you gather some basic drawing supplies if you have them before we get started.
She's making us draw? Gosh.
The drawing is, of course, optional, but encouraged, even if you have no skills.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was celebrating. I didn't realize I was unmuted.
Okay, I think since we already have about 25 people, I'll go ahead and share slides so we can get started, get introduced, and kick off this amazing session we're going to have tonight. If anyone has trouble seeing my screen as I share this, just let me know, but I'm going to give it a shot. Okay, here we go. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Rachel Carson Council tonight. My name is Joy Reeves, and I'm the Director of Policy and Strategic Development at RCC and a climate cartoonist on the side. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Rachel Carson Council, though I recognize many of you, we're an environmental nonprofit, a national nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., and we focus on environmental advocacy in the legacy of Rachel Carson, all of the issues she cared about, and of course, honoring her work in Silent Spring. And of course, we do storytelling work too on top of that. This workshop is the third in our fall workshop series. It will be the final one of the year, but we have a lot of exciting in-person events coming up that we'll tell you about at the end of the webinar. Housekeeping, you are welcome to keep your video on or off. And when we get to a brief Q&A period, we just ask that you use the raise hand feature to ask your questions, and you can unmute as we call on you to answer them. A little agenda for this evening. So I'm going to start off just kind of giving a primer on art in advocacy, because sometimes it's not intuitive how those two topics go together. But there are a lot of really cool avenues to use art or creative thinking in advocacy. Next, I'm going to kind of walk through the mechanics of creating a good climate comic idea. And a lot of that is just going to be looking at a couple of amazing climate comics that are out there on the internet as examples of the kind of nuanced thinking that is required for creating a climate comic. As we said earlier, drawing skills are not required. And especially, if you have like 15 or 20 minutes to take a stab at a climate comic, we're not asking for masterpieces. It's all about just sketching and quick brainstorming. And yeah, doesn't have to be perfect. And the third part of the workshop tonight, we will be drawing climate comics together. And anyone who feels really confident about theirs, I think it would be awesome to share out in the chat or to email your climate comics to me, and we can try to feature them in Rachel Carson Council's communications channels. So, just kicking off this session, my background in comics started off as kind of a science and art exploration. So these comics you see here, I did as far back as high school. That's when I started really drawing in earnest, creating a fictional superhero named Heliora, and even tabling at the US Science and Engineering Festival to get kids excited about Heliora and her solar energy supersuit, as well as creating comics that kind of fictionally labeled the neurology of the student brain and the educator brain while I was a student myself. So I never went to art school formally and just kind of, this is like cliche that artists always say, but like practice, 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 and you'll eventually kind of find a style that you fall into. That's basically what happened with my artwork. And now I do a lot of drawings for nonprofits, for science organizations, and commissions of that nature. This is just an example of Heliora, how you can kind of blend into this cool science fiction territory, while also, researching what would it take to create a flexible solar nanotechnology supersuit using graphene, and asking those kinds of what if questions that can create a really cool comic book idea. I later started creating comics about plastic pollution with the fictional character Neptune. again, designed to engage younger audiences in kind of this fantasy, ethereal style on what plastic pollution means for ocean communities, fictional or otherwise. So that's Neptune. And then more recently, I created a comic on climate anxiety that's actually in an interactive journal. If you're interested in it, the Youth Climate Collaborative put out this really cool journal where you can draw and write and think your way through what climate grief means. So this comic I created to kind of show like the way we present ourselves externally as climate activists, being all put together, gotta stay hopeful, this is my career calling. And then underneath the surface, questions like, should I teach my kids survival skills? Should I have kids in the first place? Guilt for wanting to make money, and all the kind of darker thoughts that we go through in climate activism, illustrated in comic form. Finally, this part of my climate comic journey is just to show that you can make really random illustrations that seem nonsensical. These are trading cards about bees, and they were very successful in getting the public engaged on the native bees of New York City on Governor's Island. It was an installation project that I did as part of a climate communications workshop. So personifying the bees, as you see here, the same way the Rachel Carson Council kind of personifies our bird of the week, giving them really charismatic traits and qualities that people can
Yeah,
relate
I'm
to.
in.
Welcome in.
So fast.
All right, so this is my climate cartooning handle, the Climate Cartoonist. But I do want to pivot and talk about comics more broadly. Like why do we draw comics? Why do we care about comics? And are they just kind of a nerdy corner of fandom, or can they unlock something for broader communication strategies? So the comic here on the left is known as the first meme. Some of you might have seen it. I think it's from the 1920s, 1910s or 1920s. And it's funny how it kind of takes on a format that many of us are familiar with on social media, how you think you look versus how you really look. Comics have been around for a very long time. Satire has been around for a very long time. And as many of you know, like there's this immense cinematic power behind comics nowadays with like the Marvel universe and DC and all of these shows that my generation has grown up with and movies, expanding our creative horizons. So if we can harness that power of comics in whether it's in a satirical way or an earnest storytelling way, it's going to change hearts and minds. I've seen it work. This is just an example from the indigenous artist Kanupa Luger, I believe their name is, and this was at Standing Rock, a living piece of art and living installation. Essentially, these protesters were pointing mirrors back at police officers just as a visual illustration of their own brutality towards the protesters. So art can be as simple as holding up a mirror to the world and illustrating its hypocrisies and injustices. We think of art as, you know, a kind of a quiet, quaint, solitary hobby, but art is loud. That's what I always like to say. Thinking about how we each can be loud in our messaging. Just digging in a little bit further into comics in advocacy, a lot of the time comics will serve as visual explainers. So if you want to read about Plastics 101 or PFAS 101, there's probably a cool comic about it on the internet. But what comics can also do, you know, they can parody society. They can highlight injustices, like we said. This comic here for Noah, as you can see, the Sheldon Sea Creatures comic, was commissioned by an environmental cartoonist. So there is lots of room for cartoonists to work with nonprofits and with advocacy groups to tell stories to the public. Um, I've also put up some pictures of, you know, wheat pasting in advocacy moments, a legal activity where, you know, you put up these illustrations and graphics in heavily trafficked public spaces. Um, and then this comic in the bottom right corner, I apologize if you can't see the text, but it's one of my favorite examples. It's the Loving Reaper comic series. This artist started to draw these comics about animals who are abused or their habitat is destroyed. and they pass away. But when the Grim Reaper comes to take them off to a better place or off across the Rainbow Bridge, right? This artist captures their last conversations and, why the world let them down, why their environment and their habitat let them down. And the comic blew up. It was one of the most viral web comics on social media and on the internet for a long time. And to me, that was a really awakening moment of people connect to comics. A lot of times the algorithm on social media will prioritize a 4-panel comic right around 5 p.m., 6 p.m. dinner time because the algorithm knows it makes people happy to read comics. It's not just an activity we enjoyed as kids, but it's a lifelong form of connecting with artists. Um, yeah, calling out hypocrisy, community organizing, and zines. If you haven't heard of a zine is basically a magazine comic, like a little mini magazine 8-pager. And those are oftentimes used in the advocacy space to like brief people on issues or on their rights or on something satirical that they want to bring light to, or maybe political satire. I will end this rambling slide by recommending that all of you check out The Most Important Comic Book on Earth. The producer of this book actually compiled a whole bunch of stories of the best environmental comics from all different authors and illustrators and celebrities in a really, really incredible book format if you're curious about learning more about comics. Um, Everything's a comic, I like to say. Everything from the PR campaigns of Smokey the Bear and what he stands for nowadays when forest management has gotten a lot more complicated and wildfire management. Everything from Smokey the Bear to the temperature stripes, of temperature anomalies, extreme heat, and this unprecedented visual colorized diagram that we see in front of us here. I've seen people turn it into scarves, into skirts, dresses, and all kinds of visual expression of this extreme weather pattern we're seeing from climate change. So what is a climate cartoon? I want to give some credit for the next couple of slides to Tom Toro and Nicole Kellner, two incredible artists who taught me about climate cartooning when I went to their workshop. So I credit some of this advice to them. A climate cartoon is funny and factual, striking that very delicate and important balance. We'll talk about that later. A climate cartoon channels a big idea through a personal situation, and oftentimes through a cute, maybe animal character-driven situation, but even more often a family situation. Who is familiar to you? What parent-kid relationships can you integrate into your comics that people will relate to? A climate comic clarifies but doesn't over-explain. So for the sake of this workshop, we're going to be focusing kind of on punchy one-panel comics. Plenty of examples to come. We're not going to be like drawing entire graphic novels. That would be a lot. But when you're dealing with a short one-panel format, I think one of the biggest pitfalls is trying to explain the climate science, the entirety of climate change science in one cartoon with jargon and statistics. And that's really not the best way to approach it. You kind of have to operate under this assumption that the viewer knows of climate change. They can do the research themselves, but you want to kind of make one point and make it well without jargon. In doing so, you kind of have to highlight the serious stakes of the issue, but with simplified solutions. So a lot of times this means kind of a sarcasm, dark irony undertone to a climate comic. But many of them have sort of a bright twist in terms of suggesting solutions. This will make more sense when we have the examples coming up. Finally, we'll talk about punctum, which is a visual theory term that basically means to pierce. And it's that inexplicable emotional feeling when something just strikes you right in your heart or your gut. And usually no caption is needed when you get that feeling from an illustration. So funny and factual. This is an example where, if you put a graph in your climate cartoon, you don't need to cover it in labels and extreme detail. You can show trends pretty generally. You can cite sources if you really need to, but you don't need to do it in the comic. And include dialogue as simple as we lowered one thing, expectations. Channeling a big idea through a personal situation. This component of climate cartooning, again, goes back to what do people care about? Family. I love you, but I love fossil fuels more. Speaking of dark irony with a bright twist on it, I think this is a really incredible example of that. Here's another example of serious stakes mixed with lighthearted irony. This cartoon is maybe my favorite climate cartoon ever by Tom Toro. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Feel free, if you've seen this one before, comment in the chat or put one of your favorites in the chat below. I'm always looking for new suggestions. This one I've seen on protest signs, I've seen it on t-shirts, I've seen it on NGO blog posts on the internet. It just tells a story in one little panel, and that's what this practice is all about. Extreme sarcasm. This is my second favorite climate cartoon. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I've seen a lot of this comic too. And, this is about probably the maximum amount of text I would put in a climate comic, but it still sends the message really well of this climate conference. So for the punctum piece, I've put two examples here, and I'll just give everybody a second to take them in before I keep blabbing. And these are two separate drawings. They're not really linked in any way, but what each of them does, you look at it for a first glance and you're like, oh, this is beautiful. This is really quaint. And then you look more closely and you see that the artist has put in a skeletal reflection and a pipe spewing pollution. And that's when you get the punctum, stabbed in the heart feeling. Same with this drawing on the right, showing in a literal way that our vegetation is our life. It's our beating heart on this planet. I'll send out these slides too, as we always do, for inspiration if anyone wants to look back. So choose your weapon. There are a lot of ways to approach climate cartooning that's not necessarily just the one panel. But if you do use the one panel, another great challenge is to see if you can avoid the word climate altogether in your cartoon. That's a sign of really powerful climate messaging, right? Because you get anyone and everyone to care about your issue. Animals, extreme weather, family, longevity, without even using the climate change buzzword. If you don't want to just stick to the one panel, there are longer stories you can do. You could develop a charismatic character, oftentimes a cute animal or a person. And that obviously takes a lot longer, but it's kind of like the examples I showed earlier. You could do a Heliora, Neptune, whoever your protagonist is, and go from there. You could create an infographic, like here are my favorite climate solutions, or here's the story of wood pellets biomass 101. If you've never heard of it, I'm going to explain it in 8 pages. That kind of approach can be really successful. I have pitched this to professors before and said, would it be okay if instead of an infographic or a text essay on solar energy plus battery storage, can I do it as a comic? And a lot of the times the professor's like, yeah, that's really cool. As long as you understand the material and explain it in a crisp and clear way, that's what cartooning is all about. So I recommend pushing the boundaries, on where you can experiment with comics in your career. Finally, distributable zines, wheat pastes, murals, all of this really cool democratized art, ways you can get people involved at a very low cost. Zines cost almost nothing to print out on your computer or a friend's computer or at a library, and that's part of the beauty. You can just mass produce them and spread your message. This is kind of a visual overview of the different comic styles. and kind of the infographic explainer route you can take with single-use plastics. I didn't draw that one, but it's great. A zine here in the bottom left corner, House on Fire, that I also didn't draw, but is a wonderful example. And the looks like the humans are still into trickle-down economics comic. I did draw in about 5 minutes, maybe less, in one of these workshops actually, a while back. So it's just a matter of getting your sketch and your idea on paper quickly. This last photo here, the comic templates, there are so many comic panel templates online. If you ever feel like just drawing the boxes out is kind of a laborious task, uh, this is the best advice I've gotten is to just print out a whole bunch of these templates, including if you're like an educator or you want to lead your own class or workshop with a breakout comic activity, printing these templates is a lifesaver. This is just an example. An amazing cohort of students from St. Mary's College of Maryland did a cartooning workshop with me, and we did these longer form graphic novel comics using the template printouts. And I'm just thrilled with how they turned out. And then finally, before we switch gears, these are a few of my more recent comics. They get more and more emotionally charged as 2025 goes on, but it's all about self-expression, right? Don't hold back if you have something emotional you want to say. I'll get into some tips and tricks for approaching creating a climate comic from scratch. The number one piece of advice I would borrow from my role model cartoonist is to start with a trope or a cliche, right? So right off the top of my head, I'm thinking desert island, people stranded on desert island, polar bears talking to each other on an iceberg, therapist, person sitting on sofa, that's a big visual cliche. And as you can see here, man wandering through desert, crawling on all fours. So those are just a couple of ones that come to mind. Start to brainstorm and think about tropes and cliches because they seem really corny and stale, and they are, but they can lead to really, really hilarious comics if you can just put the right twist on it. This artist Bizarro did here. This isn't a climate comic, but you know, it shows the cliche aspect. So just a starting point can be like the Grim Reaper. That's another visual cliche. But as I was talking about earlier with the Loving Reaper comic, the artist took that trope and completely put a spin on it. What if this Grim Reaper loves animals and loves walking them, you know, through their deaths into the next world? Things like that. Weird, cool ideas as starting points. Second tip is lean into wordplay, puns, and allusions. Not illusions, allusions. References to, you know, pop culture or famous poetry lines, musical lyrics, things like that. This Wish We Weren't Here is not even a comic. I think it's a book cover, but one of my favorite visuals. This is a comic that Dr. Musil, the RCC president, sent to me the other day, and it's just too perfect not to include. So you can see the allusion to a Lion King line converted into an amazing cartoon caption. So the format of climate cartoons for tonight is most likely going to be this one, caption and image. And maybe think about how your brain works. Maybe you're the kind of person who starts with the image and then comes up with the caption. Maybe you have the caption in your head and then just have to figure out the agony of drawing it and putting it on paper. Because yes, it's agonizing. Or maybe you're one of those artists who just has an amazing visual and you don't even need a caption, like the punctum emotional drawing. The one thing I would change about this comic up on the screen here is I would make the fish a little bit bigger because in any good climate comic, you want it to be exactly clear who's talking if you have a character speaking. And you want every single visual element to be kind of strikingly clear where there's no confusion about, you know, what the object is, who the speaker is. And with that, your comic, it doesn't have to be well drawn. This comic is XKCD, if any of you have heard of it. It's like a science nerd community comic. And as you can see, the illustrator sticks to stick figures. That's the premise of the entire comic, and it's widely celebrated and successful as a comic. I see XKCD all over the place. So it's more about like having a witty idea than a good drawing. But it still has this visual clarity where like you can tell what's going on. You can tell what the scene is, who's talking through little visual cues like, the finger pointing at the podium in this one. Um, so yeah, just boiling down the tips we just talked about into kind of a one page setup, which I'll keep up when we're doing our drawing together. Start with a scene or a cliche, turn the idea on its side a little bit using tropes, prompts, puns, wordplay, irony, satire, caricature, all of those rhetorical techniques. And some questions I usually ask when I'm trying to think of an idea is like, what is truly eyebrow raising, right? Like, what pisses you off? What's on your mind? What's happening in your local community right now that you're just itching to share out or comment on? It's like a visual op-ed or letter to the editor, callback to previous RCC workshops. Then comes the dreaded step three, sketch. Uh, I'd recommend if you have a pencil near you this evening, it's just so much less stressful to do it all in pencil, right? Make mistakes, erase them, and you can use Google Images for reference if you have to draw something really non-intuitive, like a polar bear. These polar bears I drew up here look pretty terrible, but it was a 5 minute sketch, so I was like, they're just gonna look like kind of poorly drawn polar bears and we're just gonna roll with it. So the idea is down on paper. And then yeah, like writing that caption. I drew these other two comics, Noah's Ark and the Gentleman on the Telephone comics, also in about 5 minutes each. But they'd kind of been stewing in my brain all day. So I hope we can share out some later today. I just wanted to pause for a second. If anybody had questions about climate cartooning or how to approach the sketching piece of this, feel free to use the raise hand feature and unmute. Max, go ahead.
Joy, thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question was if, I've already designed a good comic or sketched out an idea, like where would I look to submit and how would I go about doing that?
A great question. Yeah, if you're interested in submitting your comic somewhere, if you feel confident about it, or if you don't, a lot of local newspapers, digital and print, have an editorial section that is open to multimedia submissions. So they will sometimes consider comics sent in from anybody. There in larger outlets, there's kind of this like political system around like, well, if you're syndicated with the New York Times, the New Yorker, or WaPost, it's kind of a predetermined route for how they accept their cartoons and submissions. But famously, the New Yorker magazine um, opens up their editorial pool to anybody who wants to submit a batch of comics. And it's almost like a rite of passage to just keep submitting to the New Yorker over and over again, getting rejected over and over again. And then every once in a while, something will stick. I haven't reached that point yet. Very few people have, but it's a really good practice in just like cranking out, a dozen cartoons every couple of months. It just keeps you on that routine. So yeah, local newspapers, local magazines, and nonprofits and blogs. If you have a friend who has like a Substack or a blog, that's a great way to just like pro bono offer your illustrations and go from there. Get rejected and have fun with it. Diego, do you have an RCC question?
No, I actually I have a question about text. How much text do you recommend in in a comic, or is there a limit that you think about, or do you kind of just see what makes sense?
Totally forgot to go into detail on that. Thank you. When it comes to text with these one panel, we'll call them New Yorker style cartoons. You can Google that if you haven't checked out New Yorker cartoons. It's pretty text minimal. You want to tell a visual story if you can, if you have the drawing ability. Um, and you'll probably notice like not everything is labeled unless you want it to look really like political cartoon-esque. You don't have to meticulously label everything. You don't have to write out a paragraph underneath the image. Pretty minimal. But if you ever write, a graphic novel one day, or you want to do like kind of an infographic explainer, then you can start to get into high text territory.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. If you have a question during the breakout, feel free to ask it in the chat. Seeing in the chat, we all love the shareholders cartoon. It's such a classic. Now let's get into the actual drawing portion of this workshop. So, I'm gonna say 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes feels way too short, so a safe 20 to get your ideas together. This is the basic four-step process we talked about. And if you can't think of anything from scratch, here are some prompts that are helpful for getting started. Spend the next 15 to 20 minutes creating a climate cartoon from scratch, and we'll see where we land then. All right, 3, 2, 1, go. This is so fun. I'm seeing so many of the different tips and techniques, like the captionless, beautiful scene mixed with the emotional, heart-wrenching, mixed with the stupid, amazing wordplay that climate comics are all about, right? All the puns. Um, well, keep looking through the chat, keep interacting with each other, reacting to people's climate posts. And Diego, if there's a way we could somehow chronicle these, I won't share them without permission, but I just want to have them and look at them because they're so amazing. Um, this concludes the bulk of our workshop for tonight from RCC. Thank you all so much for not only showing up, but leaning into the creative and interactive portion of this. It's pretty amazing how talented people are visually and with their ideas and wit. So this has been a gift. And I have attached, if you are interested in doing more creative and storytelling exercises with RCC, we're going to kick back up our winter spring webinar series right after the holidays. Our mailing list QR code is right here if you want to stay on top of that, as well as our Eventbrite URL. If you want to go ahead and follow us on Eventbrite so you don't miss anything. The two in-person events that we will be holding in 2026, I just want to put on students' radars especially, will be our Advocacy Day in the last week of March, the 25th through 27th in Washington, D.C., as well as the boat trip, the environmental justice boat trip on the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. The date for that is April 23rd. And for both of those events, we have interest forms that will be sent out after this webinar in the follow-up email along with the slides. And then finally, for students who want to apply to our National Environment Leadership Fellowship Program, Diego has a link that I'll put in the follow-up email as well, and a flyer about what that fellowship entails. Thank you all so much again, and that's pretty much all I've got. Say goodbye to each other, clap emoji on the comics that you liked in the chat, and keep drawing. Thanks.